using modern science, we can see that there is scientific evidence that his dead body somehow rose up above the ground and was vertical, and then there was a sudden intense burst of radiant energy. And again, this isn't come at from a religious point of view. This is just looking at the evidence.
Whispers in the static, secrets leave a mark. Truth ain't in the daylight, it lives after dark. Ryan's on the trail, pulling threads apart. The Ryan Files after dark, this is where it starts. Angels on the skyline, demons in the mist. Giants in the earth, fists the size of cliffs. Nephilim footprints, history's abyss. Pyramids aligned, but who's making the list? Oh God, sleeping, Yahweh's thunder roars. Secrets in the scriptures, knocking on the doors. From Eden to the stars, the questions never pause. What's the cost of the truth? It's written in scars. Pages burning, lies unravel. Footsteps crunch where the ancients travel. Voices whisper where the echoes babble. Stay curious or let the shadows grab you. The Ryan Files after dark, peeling back the veil, igniting the spark, searching through the cosmos. Truth leaves its mark. Stay curious. This is just a start.
Hello, amazing people, and welcome back to the Ryan Files. Tonight's After Dark episode starts with the Shroud of Turin, not as a religious relic, but as a possible physical clue about consciousness itself. How did an image form on cloth in a way science still can't explain? And what does that say about what consciousness really is? My guest, Dr. Andrew Silverman, has spent years studying the intersection of history, physics, and the mind. And this conversation might change the way you see reality. This is the Ryan Files. Let's dive in. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Ryan Files. Today I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Silverman, a medical doctor and consciousness researcher who has spent decades studying the Shroud of Turin, near-death experiences, and the physics of what it means to be alive. He's the author of A Burst of Conscious Light, excellent book, by the way, right here, a fascinating exploration to whether consciousness itself is fundamental to the universe and whether the shroud may be the physical fingerprint of a moment unlike anything science can explain. Andrew, it's an honor to have you on the Ryan Files. Thank you so much for joining.
A great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. People new to your work, how you got started in this as far as the Shroud of Turin. Obviously, you're a medical doctor, but this is somewhat different. And did it start out as something maybe from a spiritual context, a faith, a science context? Kind of wrap that all up for us so we understand.
I mean, it was science, really. I as a teenager, a friend of mine showed me a video of a documentary, which was actually a BAFTA award-winning documentary in the UK called The Silent Witness. It was about the Turin Shroud, and it came out late in the 1970s. And it was actually based on a team of scientists, some who'd worked with NASA, some Jet Propulsion Lab, some there was one from Los Alamos, and these scientists were given access to the Turin Shroud for over several days and nights to do all the testing non-destructive testing that they wanted to do. To try and ascertain what the image was, how it was made. Basically, it was, of course, at the start they assumed, interviews with them afterwards said, well, we went there and we expected to find the brushstrokes in 5 minutes and then we'd be gone, sort of thing. But they all went there with it, and it wasn't a religious. This was a scientific study of the shroud, which after all is effectively an archaeological artifact rather than it's now seen as some people consider it to be a relic, but there's no actual sort of religious signs on it as such. And so they looked at the shroud in many different ways, including looking at it microscopically what they found was that the image was a surface phenomenon on 1/5000th of a millimeter thickness only on the outermost fibrils, and it had several interesting properties. One was that if you look at and this was discovered in 1898, when soon after the advent of photography, when someone, Secunda Pia, he took a photograph and he saw the negative of the shroud, because until then, if you look at the shroud image, it just appears to be sort of faint, sort of sepia, that you can sort of make out the outline of a man on there, front and back. But he was, as the story goes, he nearly dropped his photographic plate in shock when he saw that the photographic negative of the shroud image is like a positive, and also that it's a surface phenomenon, and that it's sort of fibril by fibril. It's like a little bit like the pixels on a newspaper photograph, that it's the fibers either have the image or they don't, and the intensity of the image is defined by how many of the fibrils in that little area have this discoloration. And what they found was that microscopically, the image didn't consist of anything that had been added to the cloth. It wasn't a paint, it wasn't a burn, and it was actually basically quite similar on the image fibrils to the effect of what happens to paper when it's exposed to sunlight, how it turns sort of yellowish in color. And then there was also a discovery by one of the scientists who was there, one of the lead scientists, a physicist called John Jackson, discovered that when he put the shroud image through something known as an image intensifier that had been used to interpret X-rays and so on, that basically what it does is it transforms the intensity of the image into relief. Now, if you put an ordinary photo, so that it comes out as a three-dimensional picture, if you put an ordinary photograph in there, or a photographic negative, you just get a random set of peaks and troughs, because the brightness of a photograph doesn't relate to how close that part of the body was to the photographic film. But with the shroud, it does come out in relief. So putting all these things together, Dr. Jackson realized that it was as though the shroud image had been formed by a short, intense burst of radiant energy that came from the body that it once wrapped, a body that forensic pathologists have looked at the image and have concluded that at the time the image formed, the man had already died. Okay, so this dead man somehow formed this sudden intense burst of radiant energy that came from the body of the man. Now, of course, many of your viewers are probably going to think, "Oh, yeah, that's all well and good," but of course, the carbon dating they made it look as though it's medieval. Actually, there was some excellent research that was done by a husband and wife team, Joe Marino and Sue Benford, around soon after the turn of the century of 2000, the early 2000s, and they realized that in many ways, when you look at the corner of where the sample was taken to do the carbon dating, there are differences between that and the rest of the cloth. And they put this to Raymond Rogers, who was a chemist from Los Alamos, who was one of the team of scientists that had been there. And see, Ray Rogers, he couldn't account for how the image could have got there by an artist or by even modern technology. So, and he had thought maybe this is the actual, 2,000-year-old image that we're looking at. But when the carbon dating came out, because he wanted to follow what the science showed, so he said, well, I can't see how it could have been medieval if we can't make it with modern technology, but if the carbon dating says so, then it must be. But they put it to him that actually they should be a chemical analysis, and he was a chemist, but chemical analysis to look at the fibers from where the samples were taken and compare that to the rest of the shroud. And he, at the time, he was quite annoyed by what he called these fringe researchers, and he said, I've got some samples left over from the Shroud. I've got access to them, so I think I'll be able to prove them wrong in 5 minutes by looking at and testing them chemically. And then he realized, once he did test the samples, that they were right, that there's a completely different chemical composition from the corner where the sample was taken for the carbon dating compared with the rest of the cloth. And he actually wrote a peer-reviewed scientific paper in a journal called Thermochimica Acta, saying that actually it looks like the carbon dating isn't reliable because it was taken from an area which, according to Benford and Marino's theory, which they do back up, very well with evidence, that the shroud had been subject to a repair in around the 16th century. Obviously, the corners were the most damaged. People used to take bits of it for relics or whatever, and it was also, even if you look at pictures of when it was displayed in public, it was always held obviously by the corners, and so it had been repaired, and the bit that was tested was part of that repaired area. And in fact, you can actually see what we call a gradient if you compare what the different labs because there were a few different radiocarbon laboratories who looked at it, and they got different answers. And this is something that I noticed because I was actually studying for a science degree before I got my medical degree at the time. So I used to read a famous journal called Nature. And this came out while I was doing this degree, and I noticed that if you look at in a corner where they have the actual raw data, you see they've got the error graphs that they show comparing the different labs, and it actually looks as though you can say that it's statistically significant difference, that the chance of two labs getting from dating the same object being that far apart is more than 95% probability that actually they had different ages, and they've got different ages because they've got different amounts of the later added cloth, the cotton that was added into as part of the repair. So what Dr. Jackson realized is that it looks as though this image was formed by a short, intense burst of radiant energy. And then this has been expanded on by Dr. Paolo Di Lazzaro, who's a physicist at the Atomic Energy Institute in Italy, who has done research using pulsed ultraviolet lasers, and has found that a very similar effect on linen will happen from these high intense lasers. But remember that even if you say this was medieval, and the evidence points to it actually being 2,000 years old, but if it was medieval, even today, De Lazzaro says you wouldn't be able to duplicate this with modern technology, even if you had the lasers. And so the idea of a forger or an artist doing it in the Middle Ages is a bit ridiculous. And I was at a paper 15 years ago. I was at a conference 15 years ago that Dr. Di Lazzaro organized, and where he presented these findings, which I found quite compelling. And also there was a Dr. Lavoie, a US physician, who also looked from a sort of forensic sense, looking at the image on the cloth, and he made some discoveries, which I have to say they were new to me when he said them. I don't think I would have come to realize this myself, but once I heard him say it and looked at the evidence that he provided, it made just total sense. And what he discovered was that at the there are two separate things that we can see on the cloth. One is the forensic signs of the blood and blood stains and so on that show a man who had been crucified, basically, and not in the medieval sense that I used to believe it was through the hands, but from the shroud we can see someone who was crucified through the wrists, which is actually what anatomists have said in modern times. It must have been that way because it wouldn't have worked through the hands. This was a man who'd been crucified and who had been tortured in a quite a unique way, because he'd had, you can see from the bloodstains, he'd had a cap of sharp objects placed on his head, and he'd been stabbed in the side. But what Dr. Lavoie realized is that you can see the bloodstains from when this corpse was wrapped in the shroud, and those bloodstains show that at the time when he was wrapped in the shroud was, as one would expect, wrapped around him. So he was on his back, lying on the cloth, and it was folded over his head, and because of gravity, it was curved around his face and so on. And of course, as the viewers have probably realized, if you do that and there's blood on the person, when you stretch it out and look at it flat, you'll see the blood that was on the sides of the head or on the face will be brought outwards when you look at it flat. And so what I think Lavoie's genius was to recognize that that you're seeing the blood stains are spread out in the way that you'd expect, but the body image isn't. So the body image, it's as though the shroud was flat in front of and behind the body. And interestingly, because he did sort of simple experiments with people lying down and so on, and the image on the shroud shows his hair down on his shoulders and no flattening of the tissues at the back. Because when someone's lying supine, lying on their back, you would expect that, for example, the calves and the buttocks to be flattened. Even if rigor mortis was still there, and rigor mortis is a temporary phenomenon that only affects the muscle, it doesn't affect the subcutaneous tissues, the tissues under the skin and so on. So, routinely, if you see someone or a dead body on a cadaver on a slab, on a autopsy slab, and obviously I have seen this as a doctor, you'll see this flattening, whether or not rigor mortis is present, but the flattening isn't there, and the hair would have been expected to have gone back behind, and yet it's on his shoulders. So what Dr. Lavoie realized, and what I realized listening to him that he was right, is that at the time, although the body was flat on its back when the bloodstains happened, that the actual image formation happened when the when the body was upright. So, and upright, not standing, because if you look at the feet, they're on slightly different levels, and the toes are pointing downwards. It's as though this body has somehow, this dead body has risen up vertically and is suspended above the ground at the exact moment that the image formed. And so this fascinated me to try to understand how such a thing could happen, and I do so without recourse to notions of miracle or anything actually related to organized religion. I just consider the man, the historical Jesus of Nazareth, on his own merits. What did he teach? How did he live? Not what organizations or denominations or institutions have sort of come afterwards. Some of them saying that they represent him, but just to go back to the original source as much as possible. And what's interesting is that it seems that for the image to have formed, that both the body went vertical and was suspended above the ground, and then there's this burst of sudden intense burst of radiant energy. Now, in medieval times, people wouldn't have known that that's what the image was showing. but in fact, at the time, it just looked like a faint sepia yellowish. It looks like it's probably in the outline of a man. But so what's fascinating is that with all the evidence pointing to this having been the historical Jesus of Nazareth, that actually there are stories, anecdotes during his lifetime that he was seen to somehow rise above the ground, and that sometimes it was as though he was weightless when he was said to have walked on the water, and was said to have on the mountain, people who were with him saw a bright light shining from him. And so what fascinated me, and what the idea of the book was, to try to understand this scientifically, how such a thing would happen. And to do so, of course, what I realized is that you can't do it without understanding consciousness, because surely it wasn't coincidence that this unique individual, who had very specific teachings of a certain way of living that he showed as well in his life, how could I wanted to deduce how that might be related to how such a thing was possible. And of course, what he taught was that anything that was possible for him is possible for everyone. He didn't put himself up on a pedestal. He, according to the recorded teachings that he gave, that anyone who followed his father's will was his brother, his sister, and that all of the things that people saw him do, they were also able to do, if they set their mind correctly, and mind and heart correctly, into understanding something that he pointed to, which is actually sort of 1900 years later was discovered by science, that he spoke about this universe being a universe where everything breaks down, moths, rust, and thieves. Basically, he's referring to the second law of thermodynamics, what physicists now call that everything in this universe breaks down, but there's another way that unites. He said, love your neighbor as yourself. And in the book, I sort of look at a way of trying to understand how such a thing as a physical universe could have happened. Because after all, space is just another word for separation. Okay, and I look at the nature of time and separation. We are each separate from each other, but he taught love your neighbor as yourself. He taught the opposite of separation and division. And so what I was trying to understand was how he lived, and how he sort of put his ideas into action, how he became a true reflection of those ideas, might give us a clue to how the human species might have a chance of survival, not just in physical survival, but that in understanding consciousness. And this isn't something that is new. If you look back to the 1930s, Nobel laureates Max Planck and Erwin Schrödinger were both interviewed by a newspaper in London called the Observer. And I've got, from their archives, I've got copies of these interviews, and each of these Nobel laureates, who were the founders of, two of the founders of quantum mechanics, were asked, what do you think consciousness is? How do you think it arises? And each of them independently said in their interviews that they didn't believe consciousness was a product of anything else, that it was actually fundamental. In other words, consciousness is the foundation of existence itself. And Schrödinger, in his book called What is Life, and then there's a subscript, I think, Mind and Matter, and other articles, he points out that although we have this notion of time, past, present, and future, what he called the mind, or consciousness, is always now. We always exist in the now. And this, to me, is a great clue. And I go into this in great depth in the book to understand perhaps how time and consciousness might be related, not in the sense of time giving rise to consciousness, but the opposite. That consciousness is the fundamental thing, and time is what happens when consciousness becomes limited, and such that we have the notion of a future that's not fixed may well be true, but it's the only way that it is not fixed, I argue, is because what we call freedom of will is actually real. So I go into this in a lot more detail in the book.
Well, you just dropped about 5 tons of information.
Sorry.
uh, woo. No, it's awesome to hear. And I want to dig deep on the consciousness side because, as I said before, this is before we got recording. This is something that is showing up again and again and again across a great strata of topics that you wouldn't think are interconnected, but somehow or another, this idea of consciousness seems like it's a glue. I do want to get to that, but before we do, I want to drill down a little bit on the shroud itself, because
yes,
a lot of this book is based upon the shroud, and
about
based
30% of it, yeah,
and based upon the shroud being a real artifact. And there is, Andrew, it's funny how anything that touches what a lot of people will refer to as religion, I hate the term religion, but anything that touches that, immediately there's going to be a divide of people who are like, I don't believe anything about it because I don't believe in religion or whatnot. In essence, we're just talking about, get religion out of the way of it. Okay.
Yeah. Well, the founder of the Best Shroud website about the research on the shroud, the late Barry Schwartz, when he was invited to be part of the research team to go and look at the shroud, he said to the chap who asked him, you do realize I'm Jewish? And the guy who was inviting him said, well, yes, so am I. And by the way, so was he.
Exactly. So, I think we can take, what most people refer to as religion out of this, because this is Absolutely. Really just a scientific endeavor.
Yes.
And, let the facts lead to what the facts lead to.
Wonderful.
And if that explains something that is kind of miraculous or whatever, okay, fine. But let's just keep it down on the scientific level, which I think is interesting in a lot of the research that has been done. You're talking about people from Los Alamos. This is not the kind of thing that's going to, number one, have a religious agenda out the gate. They just want to understand what this phenomenon is that they're seeing. And it is a phenomenon. Now, of course, as you demonstrated, a lot of people right out the gate, want to say, hey, that thing's not real. It carbon dates to the 1600 medieval times. But we also know, like you said, that the two different material where they took the original sample for carbon dating is different than the rest of the shroud. There is a method in medieval times of fixing, tapestries and linens and whatnot with a very intricate, which was technology of the time, a very intricate.
That's right. They call it invisible reweaving. And actually the conclusion of the Damon et al. Paper, the one published in Nature in early 1989, they thought that the shroud was formed sometime between 1260 and 1390. But what Benford and Marino suggested and provided a lot of evidence for is that that age is based on the different proportion of fibers from the original shroud, which is probably over 2,000 years old, and what was added in the 16th century reweave to that corner where the sample was taken from. And actually, even within that tiny 7-centimeter strip of cloth that was subject to the carbon dating, along the length of that strip, they got different ages based upon, I would argue, the different proportions of the original cloth and what was added later.
Yeah. So there's definitely evidence there to show that, maybe that original carbon dating just was off.
Mm.
And so that lends itself. And is there any
Even
other,
even
go ahead.
sorry, even one of the leader of the Oxford carbon dating laboratory, the current leader, who was actually one of the research team in the carbon dating time, but he later became the leader of the carbon dating lab. He said that that despite the carbon dating showing a possible medieval origin, there's so much other information that suggests it looks much older than that. That he thinks that he's open to the possibility that it could be older, basically. So now, I mean, there is a lot of data around the shroud showing where and when it was, so to speak. You can trace it back to several centuries before the time it showed up in France, in Lire. It had been in Constantinople, and that that there's evidence to suggest before that it had been in Edessa, and also there is some evidence of how it might have got there from the Jerusalem area. Looking at the forensically, this is a victim of Roman crucifixion. Now, as you know, the Roman Empire wasn't still around in in medieval times. It sort of fizzled out in the around the 4th century and so on. And it was looking at the pollen on the cloth. It can be triangulated that it was at some time around March or April exposed to the elements in the Jerusalem area from the pollen that is showing up on there, that is sort of from that area, and some of it sort of more localized, not to such a wide area. And the interesting thing is that most of the time, because this was a method of torture that the Romans did because they were an occupying force, and that they made examples of the people who were under occupation, and that they used to leave them on the cross to rot, or let the animals sort of get at them. But there was a certain period in history between AD or Common Era 6 and 66, where because they came to an agreement with the sort of religious leaders locally there, the Jewish leaders, the Romans didn't agree to stop crucifying the local people, who were mostly Jews. They were going to still carry on doing it, but at least they said that they would make a concession, that they would allow them to have a traditional burial. Now, as many of your viewers may know, the Jewish burial it has to be very quick, soon after someone has died, and between 6 and 66, that was the case that was allowed. So this appears to be a victim of Roman crucifixion who was tortured and killed around the Jerusalem area in either March or April, at some point between the years of 6 and 66. That's what the evidence points to.
Right. And, you can forensic data, you can follow it, with the carbon dating and prove it wrong. And there's a lot of people are like, oh, well, it's not real because of that. It gets proven wrong. But a lot of people won't accept what you just laid out with the pollen and whatnot, where forensically you can place this thing at a certain time and place and region. It's very fascinating. Very fascinating. Are there any other, the carbon dating was definitely one of them, but are there any other major factors that go into the potential disbelief category, so to speak, that you can reference?
Not that are actually scientific evidence, not that actually sort of survives when you look at it analytically and actually consider the evidence. There have been some people who have said that they try to make. I think Luigi Galliscelli was one of them. They tried to make something a bit like the Shroud image, but it never has the similar features that the Shroud does. For example, the 200 nanometers thickness of the image area, and because if all the methods that they do, that they try and come up with, don't actually produce a similar thing. So it can't even be done with 21st century technology. So it sort of defies belief to think that someone hundreds of years ago was able to have superior technology to what we have now in order to make this as in some kind of an artificial way.
Yeah, it's very fascinating, because what you end up with is, okay, let's go down the rabbit hole of assuming that this is a Jewish man who was crucified between 6 and 66. And, the next question that people will ask is, well, why do you think this is Jesus?
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that as part of crucifixion, what was unique to him wasn't just the fact that he was also whipped, but the cap of sharp objects placed upon his head, which we know is said to have happened to him, and also the fact that he was pierced in the side, again from the forensic evidence that's on there. So these do sort of point it to it being him, and also the speculation that I mean, he obviously made a huge impression on the world in his life, what he taught and how he lived, and is sort of admired and recognized by people, not just people who consider themselves Christian, but for example, Muslims consider him to be a prophet. And if you go to countries where there are sort of Hindus, they often consider him among their sort of God, so to speak. That you'll see an image of him next to an image of Vishnu, or that people will. That he is, a lot of people recognize that he was a very significant human being. And what's interesting, as I say, is that using modern science, we can see that there is scientific evidence that his dead body somehow rose up above the ground and was vertical, and then there was a sudden intense burst of radiant energy. Now, this, as I go into more depth and detail in the book, this might be consistent with the notion that people reported that after he had died, that he was still around, that they saw him. He was somehow appeared changed, and they didn't quite sort of necessarily recognize him straight away. But it could be that and again, this isn't come at from a religious point of view. This is just looking at the evidence that what we may be seeing as the image may be similar to a photograph, if you like, of that moment where he came back after he'd been died and put in that tomb. That this may actually be sort of physical evidence that may have sort of actually sort of literally happened.
Right.
It's according to the reports from the time that people now call Gospels, that someone walked into the tomb and they saw and believed. Now, what did they see? It was said that the shroud was left there. Maybe that's what they saw. That was the image. Now, if they had done that, it wouldn't have been something that they would have, necessarily advertised or, or told people about, because according to the the Jewish religion, it's not thought to be good to make sort of images of people in a sense of considering that to be that person to be more sort of somehow in some way special, because that could be considered idolatry. But of course, that relates to images made by human hands, and of course the people who found the shroud in the tomb with the image on it, they would have known that this wasn't made by human hands, but that other people might not have, agreed with them. So it's quite likely they would have kept it a secret, which would be why there isn't much sort of mention of the image on it. Although there is some, it's said that there's some evidence there was someone called Abgar in Edessa who it said that he sent obviously there wasn't emails in those days. He sent a message via someone to Jesus. He'd heard of the wonderful things that he had done, and he was hoping that he'd come and visit him. And it said that he said that he obviously, Jesus didn't make it there physically during his lifetime, but it said that his shroud was taken there afterwards. And if that's correct, then that would be sort of one of the first steps in how it got from Jerusalem to being in France in the 13th century.
Yeah, for sure. It's a wild path, the history of the travel of the shroud and how we end up with it in modern day. Now, for the people that aren't able to visualize this, I'll just use a piece of paper. Imagine this is the shroud, and the body is lying on this half, and it's being wrapped over it, and then falls down. We can all kind of, I think, visualize, especially a human being that was crucified in such a terrible way. We can imagine the blood stains, all this stuff. But the most fascinating thing about the shroud to me is this, as you call it, a burst of conscious light. It's only on the inside part of the shroud. It's a very thin layer of this, radiation impacting the linen cloth. It doesn't go all the way through. But this person was wrapped in this shroud, obviously around the sides of the face and everything like that. For that to happen, is something had to happen inside of the shroud that is hard to explain unless you apply the science. I mean, kind of drill down a little bit deeper on that, because that's a real fascinating thing. This light, we can see that you can recreate this kind of phenomenon with radiation light. But it was only on the inside. It didn't go all the way through. So, and it's not something that you can just paint or whatever. And I think part of the problems in some experiments have been trying to impact a linen cloth with radiation like that, but it'll go all the way through. There's just a real interesting scientific side to that.
Yes, and in some ways, this to relate to this in a simple way from some of what Einstein discovered about light, and in particular the speed of light. Now, what relativity tells you about light is that for a light beam, if you like, for a light, if it has an origin and a destination, that from the point of view of the light, there's no separation in space or in time between the beginning and the end. So it's as though at the speed of light, you're instantly everywhere. And it has been suggested, in fact, great physicist by the name of David Bohm suggested that you could actually say that matter is frozen light, that light is the natural nature of being in space and time, and somehow it gets frozen to, instead of being instantly everywhere all at once, it's like stuck as a knot, if you like, in one place.
Yeah.
Oversimplification, but and that does sort of tie into E equals mc squared. But so it may be that what was actually happening at that moment is that he was actually unfreezing the light. The clue is that to light there is no separation, and this is the point that he taught, is that if one, it made sense to love one's neighbor as oneself, not just as a religious platitude, but as an actual factual statement of fact, that actually we are, at a fundamental level, we're all one. So basically, what I came to realize through looking at what even these quantum physicists that I spoke about, like Erwin Schrödinger and so on, said, that if you read his writings, you'll see a derivation of the notion that consciousness has to be eternal, that actually time is a product of consciousness and not the other way around, which means that you have no beginning or end. So you don't have a beginning, right, in terms of your identity now with the name and the body that you have. Obviously you were conceived and born, but what's looking out from behind your eyes, your consciousness, actually has no beginning. It doesn't happen, it can't be created, it can't evolve into existence, and it can't be manufactured. That it actually has no beginning at all. Now, and I go into the logical derivation for why I say that it has no beginning in more detail in the book, but if consciousness has no beginning, then how do we account for the fact that the universe has a beginning? So how could consciousness be eternal if time only began when the universe began? So let's say time did begin when the universe began. Consciousness doesn't need time to be eternal. So when the universe began at the Big Bang from a singularity, it doesn't make so much sense necessarily to say before the Big Bang, although it might do. There are some theories, such as Penrose's cyclical conformal cosmology notion, that there's a Big Bang and then eventually the universe spreads out and ceases to be, and that generates another one. But either way, it's always still a singularity at that point that the Big Bang happened. So rather than saying before the Big Bang, I would say that beyond the Big Bang, in the where there is no space, time, or matter, there must still be consciousness. Now, if there's no space, time, or matter, then consciousness isn't divided. Interestingly, and this is another thing that Professor David Bohm pointed out in one of his books, the word individual actually derives from, etymologically, means undivided. But actually, maybe that's true. That actually, not that you are an undivided, separate individual, but that fundamentally, at our root state of being, beyond the Big Bang, we're all one. And perhaps that's what Jesus referred to as his Father, and why he said that anyone who does the will of that oneness, a union, which another word for that, if what divides and separates things like prejudice, racism, selfishness, any sexism, ageism, any of the things that divide human beings from each other, is going the opposite way to that union state that he referred to. And that's why he said that the route, the pathway to that, is love your neighbor as yourself. That's actually mathematically makes sense, but making sense of it, of course, it's not quite as simple as to say, all right, intellectually understand that makes sense. One has to actually recognize it. And what he, I believe, taught and showed is why we should be in awe at every single human being, how precious they are, to recognize that each human that what he showed, what he achieved in his life, he made a point of saying every single human being is potentially like him. So he didn't. I think that was what he. If I can take the liberty of trying to interpret what he was saying, obviously I've got no way of knowing if I'm right or not, except if it seems to make sense. But I think what he was saying is that if we recognize, if we understand that, that's why he said, anything you do to the least of mine, you do to me. That actually every single human being has the same potential, and if we're in awe of that humanity and value it so much, that then is expressed in how we live and how we are, then we may actually have a chance of becoming more like him. And the crucial point is that, really, in a sense, I consider what he taught and did to be the opposite of the way our world is going now, with things like so-called artificial intelligence and so on. As I read an interesting book, again, when I was a lot younger, in the late 1980s, again, mentioning before, Professor Penrose wrote a book called The Emperor's New Mind, like the story of the Emperor's New Clothes. And it's about artificial intelligence and about how people are just talking. Everyone's convinced because all these learned people are saying this will say this machine is sentient, so people believe it. But the little child who isn't sort of indoctrinated to think the way that they do actually knows that his computer is a thing, it's something, not someone, and that's the difference. That basically any computer program is basically a string of ones and zeros. And the point that I put to people is, how long does a string of ones and zeros have to be? Because people say, oh, it's just because it's so complicated, that's why it becomes conscious. But how long does a string of ones and zeros have to be before it becomes someone rather than something? Or they'll say, oh, yes, but once it starts processing information about itself, then that's self-awareness, and then it's conscious. So as I often said when I given lectures around the world, and so you point a video camera at its own, at a mirror, so it's filming its own reflection, right? Is it conscious now? It's processing information. It's just a total nonsense. And most people deep down, whatever they say they think, they don't really think that computers are conscious. Just like people who say they don't believe in free will will still give credit or blame for people's actions. But if they had no free will, then what they did is what they were going to do anyway. So why do you blame them, or why do you praise them for it? I think basically these points that are actually, once they're analyzed and once you look at them, I think they become self-evident.
Yeah. It's interesting how you get into, and I'm really going to dumb this down. Okay. Forgive me.
Okay.
It's interesting how you get into, for lack of a better term, just on the layman's term here, good and evil. All right. Let's associate maybe for a second the concept of good is love your neighbor. And the concept of, murdering your neighbor is evil. All right. Those are the two big extremes. One thing that we do know scientifically is that with negative actions, emotions, words, there is a measurable negative frequency on the negative stuff, and a measurable good frequency on the good stuff. And I wonder if in any way this is related, because whenever you start talking about frequencies, all of a sudden then you're getting into physics. And I believe that there is a logical universe out there. And what you're talking about when it comes to consciousness, the act of love your neighbor can be maybe we don't have the math for it today or the physics for it. I do know that there's people studying this in physics and whatnot, but there's an equation of how and why that presents positive fruit or whatever, or consciousness or whatever it is. I don't even know really the words how to describe it, but there is this concept that these principles of, love your neighbor and so on and so forth are positive for a reason, because in the world of science, the physics behind it, there is an actual cause and effect that happen whenever these positive things happen. And likewise, conversely, the negative things.
Well, when you say a frequency, how do you mean a frequency for positive and negative things? Do you?
Go ahead.
No, I was just wondering, because I think that in a sense, equations are about numbers and in a sense relate to a world of separate parts, and that what we're talking about is basically there aren't many numbers that you need for it, and you could consider it, if you want to look at numbers, look at the notion of 0 divided by 0, that the universe came from nothing, no thing, and yet it was divided. Now 0 divided by 0 is both nothing, because it's 0 over anything is nothing. It's 1 because anything divided by itself is 1, and it's infinite because anything divided by 0 is infinite. So I think actually there aren't equations that will generate empathy or caring. In fact, just as you have no beginning and there's nothing that can create you, the love, as in what Jesus was, I think, referring to when he said, "Love your neighbor as yourself," and what he showed is it's a spontaneous thing, which somebody in a sense doesn't choose to do, but it's a natural consequence of who they are. So though I talk about free will a lot in the book, in a sense you can have the will not to cause harm to others, and that's a start. But the actual empathy and to care about others isn't something that you can switch on like a switch, sort of painting by numbers, as it were. But perhaps when people recognize how the grandeur and the preciousness and the limitless potential and the eternal scope of every single human being, if they actually realize that deeply enough and care enough because of what they recognize, then that caring, that love is natural. And of course, there are some people who don't need to understand these things intellectually. They're just natural empaths and so on. But I think that using reason, there is a route for even people who don't have that naturally, to show them why it makes sense to understand, to basically understanding the nature of humanity and consciousness, recognizing that huge scope resides in every human being, and so and I think that's what he was teaching people, and what he was sort of demonstrating with his life.
So what's the, and I mean, I hate to bring it into these terms, but this is the way a human being thinks. What's the significance of this? There's a lot of people that will never think on this deep of a level about consciousness, or how you're deriving, thoughts about it from the Shroud of Turin. A lot of people just won't go that deep, but they will ask the question, well, how does this impact me? Well, why does this matter to me? And I think that's an important question to answer.
Oh, absolutely, it is. Yeah. Well, if one doesn't understand what consciousness is, if one thinks it's just something that is from the wiring in the brain or program, then there's nothing to stop people from going down these dead end and destructive paths. For example, this notion of wanting to make transhumanism and sort of implant chips into people, thinking that that's the way to enhance consciousness, or to think that you can upload the human mind into a machine, that if you put the people look at the pathways of connections between all the neurons in the brain, and they say, right, if I can mirror that in a computer, then that will be me. And then they sort of get rid of the original actual living person, and with the nonsensical sort of irrational belief that they can continue forever in that machine. So it does have, as technology goes on, it does have definite repercussions. But also looking at scientific evidence, one of the main, we mentioned the shroud already, but one of the other things I look at in depth in the book is about what are known as near-death experiences, that for which there's a lot of scientific evidence. And I've spoken to people like Pim van Lommel and Ibn Alexander. In fact, they were kind enough to write nice things on the cover of my the if you look at the book on the I think it's the back, there's quoted statements from them. These are near-death experience researchers, both of them medical doctors. So Dr. Van Lommel is a cardiologist, and Dr. Alexander is a neurosurgeon. And so Dr. Alexander was he, as a neurosurgeon, he was an expert in the brain, and he was just always assumed that the brain was what made his mind and made people's minds, and that's why he could sort of operate on their brains when things were wrong and help improve things. And this was up until the moment that he himself had a near-death experience. Now, the point about near-death experiences to me isn't a sort of religious dimension, as it were. It's the fact that people are having conscious experiences when their brain is effectively not working at all. The brain is dead. If you take a EEG, electroencephalogram, from the brain, you get a flat trace. But during that time, when it's flat, people are having these very in-depth conscious experiences, which they then can recall once they're resuscitated. And according to conventional neuroscience, if the mind were residing in the brain, and the brain is related to memory, it shouldn't be able to either be conscious or be storing new memories during the time when it's not functioning. And in many instances that people have seen things during, even blind patients who have had near-death experiences have seen, from looking above the body, looking down as it were, and seeing what was happening, and been able to recount specific details of their own resuscitation of things that happened. Famously, there was one case where after someone was resuscitated, they were looking for his teeth, and he said, "Oh, I saw that nurse took them away while you were while you were pounding on my chest," and he'd actually been watching, as though from the ceiling looking down, while they'd been sort of working on his body, trying to resuscitate him. Because so if consciousness is eternal, then what determines how it continues? So actually, what I believe, that not just Jesus, but the great teachers such as the Buddha and basically all of the great teachers, were the notion of loving your neighbor as yourself, and forgiveness and compassion is sort of central to the teachings of all of the great teachers. And basically what you're doing is preserving your own existence in the best, most broadest sense, to be able to perceive and act with the greatest freedom. Because basically the point that I make in the book is that when we divide, when we have things that limit and restrict and divide people from each other, all the various sort of isms and so on that divide mankind, then and this is what in the near-death experiences, what people often do they have a sort of this idea of everything rushing before their eyes, of seeing what happened during their life. Well, this does actually happen in NDEs, and it's surprisingly common how many people have actually had these experiences. And what people often recount is that anything that they did that was kind to another person, they felt that kindness from the other way around. They felt it being done to them, and anything that they had done that was cruel, for example, where they tried to harm people, that they felt that harm as though it was done to themselves. They didn't have a sense that there was some divine figure that was sort of judging them, but their own conscience was, they're judging themselves by what they did. So actually, by being kind to one's neighbor, one is actually being kind to oneself. But as I say, you can't contrive empathy just by saying that. But it's a start that at least as an antidote to wanting to cause harm, if you like. That just even if someone's completely selfish, they'll know that if they understand these points, that they will be harming themselves by harming others, and that actually, in a way, the best way to help themselves is not to be selfish.
Yeah, it goes back to do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. I mean, it's the same principle, where you're, and some people might even call it karma or whatever, but these are principles that have existed for a long time, that you're demonstrating. And now the near death experience thing is interesting, because when you look at that particular example of near death experiences and what's happening, Andrew, it seems clear, and that's just one of many examples of this, but it seems clear that there is a consciousness, let's call it consciousness, maybe there's a better word, I don't even know, that exists within, but also without us, outside of us, that is there accessing things that we in this physical body either don't think we can access, maybe can't access. I don't know what exactly it is, but it feels like it is present in not only just our lives and our bodies and what we deal with on the day-to-day basis, but it's also tapping into something bigger. It feels like that.
Yes. And that what it is tapping into that's bigger, I think what Jesus was alluding to is, in a sense, our higher self, that we all we didn't begin, our consciousness didn't begin, but our separation began. So beyond the Big Bang, if you like, we're all one, and that's beyond time, so it doesn't change. I think this is what for example, in Buddhism is referred to as the Buddha nature, and perhaps what he was referring to as his father is actually all the union of all consciousness without any limitation or restriction or division, which he didn't just say that it was his father, he said it was ours, and that and people sort of think that he was singling himself out as unique. But again, he said, anything I do, you also can do, and people who do my Father's will are my brothers, my sisters. So if people say he was the Son of God, then he was also saying that all human beings can be sons and daughters of God.
Yeah, and that's basically the crux of the message, in the Bible, and in other religions as well.
Yes, indeed.
What's the big takeaway? Okay, that's the thing. Understanding this concept, what should the end game be in people's lives? and why. And if everyone was kind of on board with understanding what you're talking about, what would the world be like?
Well, I mean, if so, it's one thing, of course, to understand on an intellectual level. It's another thing to actually become the fruition of that understanding, which many people might have done, whether or not they had that understanding. So I'm no example of of the fulfillment of these ideas, but you can look at great people who we can point to who are examples of it. Of course, Jesus is an example. In more modern times, we've had people like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, people who basically their life was sort of all the time they were uh, totally trying to demonstrate the preciousness of all human beings, and to show why we should respect and value each other. So, I mean, if we really could live in the way that they were demonstrating, of course, there'd be no war, and perhaps the human race would have a chance of survival against all the threats, many of which are man-made, and but also not just physical survival, but that what I think Jesus and many of the other great teachers were pointing to is that there's a way of existence beyond this physical reality, an eternal existence, that we don't have to have physical bodies and so on, that beyond death. I think there is a lot of evidence in favor of the notion of reincarnation. And talking of the example of Jesus, one could argue that was accepted and assumed to be true by his followers, because otherwise, when they were talking about, but some people say before that Elijah has to return, and he said, I tell you, he already has returned, but people didn't recognize him. And according to the gospel, it says, and they understood he was talking about John the Baptist. Hang on a second. Elijah was someone who had been around several centuries before, and yet he'd returned as John the Baptist. Isn't that reincarnation?
Yeah.
And he didn't contradict them and say, what are you talking about? He's in fact, he actually specifically said that he did come back. So I think this is the notion you were alluding to, the notion of karma, the Hindu Buddhist notion that has been around for at least several thousand years, and there are people who have children who have past life memories and know details about their previous existence that they couldn't have known. There's lots of sort of scientific evidence about this, and so the notion that they have in with the wheel of rebirth in Hinduism and Buddhism is that that there is a way that it's actually a bit like a vicious circle, that we keep coming back because we don't learn. This is actually a limited way of being, to be physical, and if we can, they see it as the goal to escape that, to escape needing to come back, and arguably Jesus sort of showed a way of living that does achieve that, because coming back puts you at risk of pain and suffering, and he alluded to that, like, as I say, with his allegory of moths and rust and thieves, that things break down in this physical universe, but there's another way of existing, which doesn't mean that people should die prematurely to achieve that. I think our physical life is a great opportunity to learn and to hopefully to develop along the lines that these teachers were showing us, that was actually rationality would show us that this makes sense for ourselves and for each other.
Very much so. Do you think we're talking in any way soul, spirit, in any of this?
Well, you see, I tend not to use the term soul, because often it's sort of my belief is that if you were to get Jesus and the Buddha and Muhammad and Moses and Abraham and Guru Nanak and all the the
wild
great,
party,
yeah, into a room together, they wouldn't be sort of having sectarian fights or saying I'm a this and you're a that or whatever. They would all be like brothers. They all had basically at its root, the message was the same. So I think I've got a friend who's I mean, I don't sort of subscribe to any particular religion or denomination, but I have a friend who's a Catholic priest who told me that a story of he had a chat with a Muslim person who said, Father, religion might divide us, but God unites us. That I think the way I see it is religion is like the shadows cast by man upon the light of God, that we each have our own particular shadows, but the light is still the same, for whether from all of the great teachers, that what they were actually alluding to, what they were sort of representing in their teachings and their actions, is all it's not divided up in that sense.
I understand. Interesting topic, man. And I would encourage people, if you want to get challenged a little bit, read the book, A Burst of Conscious Light. What would you tell people, Andrew, why they should go out and read this book, and what you want them to absorb by reading it?
So in a sense, I would say you don't need to see it as a book about the shroud. It's not really, though it does look at the evidence on the shroud and how the image might have formed. But really, it's a book about the reader. It's taking them on what I believe to be a logical journey to consider their own consciousness. What is it? Where does it come from? And interestingly, people say, but consciousness, what is it? Is it really anything at all? Nobody can really define it. And you see, the problem with that is that when we define something, we have to define it in terms of something else. So you can say what a table is compared to a chair, and a chair is compared to a table. But consciousness is actually the fundamental ground of all existence. So you can't define it in terms of anything other than itself. So all your viewers and listeners, they know what consciousness is because they're conscious. They can't sort of write a statement of defining what it is that a computer could understand, because computers don't understand. And that's the point. And I was alluding to what Penrose said in his book, The Emperor's New Mind, that although the journey towards trying to find AI and so on can have lots of dangers, but it's never truly intelligent, in the sense that to be intelligent, one must understand, and to understand, one must be conscious. And a string of ones and zeros doesn't ever wake up and become conscious. So I think, in answer to your question, the book is sort of showing people a way of understanding why that is. How is it that there is a conscious being looking out from behind their eyes as they read the book and consider the ideas in it, and And what does that actually mean? What's the significance of that? If they look out at the night sky and they see, those tiny little dots, the hundreds of billions of galaxies, each with hundreds of billions of stars, and apart from if there may be life on some of those, the rest is just completely dead. And yet in their mind's eye, and this was pointed out to me by someone about 40 years ago when I was quite young, that someone got me to look out at the sky and realize that what I'm seeing, that huge panoply of dots that extend for all those hundreds of billions well, tens of billions of light years, that somehow in your mind it contains all that, because you can look out and you can perceive it. So your mind is actually bigger than everything that is coming into your eyes. You're actually, and that makes real sense in the sense that if you point a camera at it and it takes a photo, it's not seeing what it's taking a picture of. It's not perceiving it, it's not experiencing it, but you have this magical, for want of a better word, it seems magical to us, but actually it's completely natural state of consciousness that can actually perceive. And this is the point that I've been to. For example, I was at one of the speakers at Society for Scientific Exploration in annual conference in San Francisco, and there was a very expert presenter there called Dean Radin, who has done lots of research proving basically beyond any reasonable doubt, doing what's known as meta-analyses of all the studies that have been done on things like extrasensory perception and mind over matter, that basically prove that it's real. And my talk came after his. It wasn't about the shroud, it was about time, space and matter and consciousness and how they're related. And basically what I was saying is, it's wonderful that people have done this, but maybe we've now reached a time where, rather than questioning whether these things are true, we try to understand what they actually are and what they mean. Because after all, actually, right now, each of us looking at our screens is perceiving what we're seeing. And your eyes are transmitting data to your brain, but your brain is just, there's electrical activity, there's something else, there's a consciousness of that. And that consciousness doesn't happen in those senses. It doesn't happen in the eye or the ear. In fact, in the ancient Indian texts called the Upanishads, they actually refer to this. They call it the eye of the eye and the ear of the ear, that consciousness is beyond senses. It's extrasensory perception. Just being conscious is extrasensory perception. Every time you make a decision, that's mind over matter. So just in terms of your everyday experience, these things that people see as magical and they want to see, oh, can people bend spoons, or can they see something that they couldn't have known about? You see, although those things happen, you don't need that to know about that to see the verification of the notion, because just from basic rational thinking, you can realize that right now in this moment, your perception is beyond your senses because of consciousness from behind your eyes, behind your brain, if you like. And you have this power of choice, which any galaxies that are devoid of life out there, the huge, unimaginably large structures, nowhere in that galaxy is there anything that can match what you as a human being, which judged physically is just a tiny little dot compared to that, but you have something that is beyond that and more powerful than it. In fact, there's a great physicist called Andre Linde, who's a professor at Stanford, actually, and he wrote a book about 35 years ago on fundamental physics thing called inflationary cosmology. But that's not so. The point that he made in that book, he made a reference to some evidence that he had seen by looking at quantum theory and so on. He came to the same conclusion as Max Planck and Erwin Schrödinger had done sort of 60 years before, that it appears that consciousness is fundamental, that in a very real sense, that is you and all the viewers and listeners, are the creators of existence because they have consciousness, because they have free will. So what the book is actually doing is it's showing you that your size and grandeur beyond your imaginings, but not just you as the viewer or the reader, but every other human being as well. It's showing you why this is a living planet with human beings like we have here is such an amazing oasis in this dead universe that has such limitless meaning and eternal scope. So I take the reader on a journey to try to understand that, not through any dogma or religion, just simply through reason, rationality, and what they can actually perceive themselves.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you this. Whenever you realize you matter, and I don't say that that sounds really simple, but you matter because you have consciousness. You have something special. I think most human beings walk through life, get up, go to a job, go home, never even think about it, never think there's anything special about me or this planet or this race, or all of humanity. I think we are kind of blinded by it, but I will tell you this, Andrew, again, more and more and more and more, this concept of consciousness is coming up, and it's connected to everything, and probably rightfully so. I don't know if it's AI that is waking people up to asking questions about, well, what is consciousness, or whatever it is, but we are in a time right now, for whatever reason, where this question is coming up and people are starting to wake up and ask questions.
I think, unfortunately, AI is more likely to be the opposite, in the sense that it's putting a sort of artificial thing that it's presenting as though it's conscious,
right,
although it actually isn't. Right. And there are a lot of the founders of artificial intelligence are now going public to say that that they think that if it goes unchecked, that it's quite likely to lead to the extinction of humanity. In fact, Professor Martin Rees, who was the astronomer royal in England, he wrote a book about the 21st century called it Our Final Century, and in the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. In Cambridge, they've got something called the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, and in Oxford, the Future of Humanity Institute, and lots of their, and this is quite sort of this isn't fringe. This is top scientists. For example, Stephen Hawking once said that if we ever encounter extraterrestrial life, it's probably not going to be anything living. It's probably going to be some technological artifact that's left over, because by the time you get technologically advanced enough to have interstellar travel, the lifespan of living what they call organic biological beings is quite short. They very quickly become redundant. So it's in a sense, the book is showing a distinction, a fundamental distinction between what looks out from behind your eyes and what doesn't look out from behind the camera on your phone. That it's not aware, it's not conscious, it's something, it's not someone. You're someone, and all human beings are someone, and it's showing people to recognize the preciousness of that, and that is something that, as I say, it has no beginning. So it's not created, and it doesn't evolve itself into existence, and it's not can't be manufactured. It extends right beyond the Big Bang, and has no beginning at all. And I demonstrate that, I would suggest, in a sort of in a rational way. I have put these points to quite learned experts, and so far no one has poked any holes in it. In fact, as you can see, if you look at the cover, Dr. Alexander and Dr. Van Lommel felt that that it's actually that I do sort of back up what I'm saying rationally, and it fits with what they have discovered through their own research on near-death experiences that do support this notion of consciousness. But from the perspective of the Shroud, which is how we began, I think you'll find that there aren't other. Generally, most of the research is about the details, about which is all very valuable. The research on the reweaving that happened, and the pollen and so on, and the forensic evidence about what happened to this man and so on is, and I've learned a lot from what those researchers have found. And I mentioned about what Dr. Lavoie discovered, and Dr. Jackson, and Dr. De Lazaro. The great insights that I've learned from what is in this book, which is a bit different to what you'll find elsewhere, is taking you through sort of in a detailed way, starting at your own consciousness, at the fact that there's something behind your eyes that's looking out and perceiving that book, and extending to an understanding of how mind and matter are related, that might be able to go away towards explaining what happened in that tomb in a way that makes sense, without needing to rely on saying words like miracle or supernatural. In fact, I would say that it is the epitome of true nature, that what we have become is, in a sense, is subnatural. That if every single moment of our lives, all our perception is extrasensory, every time we make a choice, that's mind over matter. The fact that we've become limited and live lives that that don't add to this to the knowledge in the way that he did, and don't achieve the things that he did, is because we're perhaps less than natural. He related to perhaps a prior state of existence that we had, where there wasn't that restriction, that limitation, that self division from others, and so it was just natural to him to love his neighbor as himself, because he could see that fundamentally we're all one.
Fascinating concepts, fascinating book. And I encourage people to go out there and challenge yourself and check it out. Verse of Conscious Life. Dr. Silverman, thank you so much. Where do people find this book, get this book, find out about you, any new projects coming up, any research, anything?
Well, there's the website, andrewsilverman.co.uk, which actually alludes to the book. There's a website I also have called lightoftheshroud.com. I don't think it'd be particularly interesting for listeners to find out about about me so much, but about the ideas in the book is the best way, is I suppose, to get it and read it. I mean, it's distributed by Simon and Schuster. It's published by Inner Traditions. It's available, can be ordered from bookshops, from Amazon. I think there's my webmaster has put a link on andrewsilverman.co.uk that goes to the Amazon website for ordering it, and also on lightoftheshroud.com some of my talks that I've given. For example, the one I mentioned at San Francisco, I believe, is there from the Society for Scientific Exploration, and also a talk I gave at a Shroud conference. The video of it is on there as well.
Awesome. And the folks at Inner Traditions have been so great. I know your sister who's been on, Danielle Silverman, is with Inner Traditions. They are great people. I would encourage people, go over to innertraditions.com. I will leave a link in the description below about this, but I really appreciate you taking the time and talking about this. And I'm challenged just to maybe think through this a little bit more and realize that our lives aren't just random things that don't really matter. And our consciousness is something special. So
I agree. Thank you.
Very good. Have a blessed day. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. This has been awesome. One and another, Dr. Andrew Silverman. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me on.
A big thank you to Dr. Andrew Silverman for sharing his study and perspective tonight. What really stands out to me is how many people today are searching for the meaning of consciousness. Why is that happening? What does it say about us and about what might be ahead? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Where do you believe consciousness comes from? If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe and consider becoming a channel member for emojis, badges, and early access. And for those that want to show their support at a deeper level, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/The Ryan Files. You can also watch full episodes, bonus content, and updates anytime at theryanfiles.com. And don't forget, follow the podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts so you never miss an episode. You folks are awesome. Be amazing, be positive, and stay curious out there, my friends. And I'll see you next time right here on The Ryan Files.
Whispers in the static, secrets leave a mark. Truth ain't in the daylight, it lives after dark. Ryan's on the trail, pulling threads apart. The Ryan Files after dark, this is where it starts. Angels on the skyline, demons in the mist. Giants in the earth, fists the size of cliffs. Nephilim footprints, history's abyss. Pyramids align, but who's making the list? Oh God, sleeping, Yahweh's thunder roars.